Captain John Liebert stood on the bridge of the Nemea, hands clasped behind his back, his dark eyes fixed on the swirling patterns of hyperspace outside the main viewport. The hum of the ship's engines vibrated through the hull, a steady rhythm that gave the crew an odd sense of calm in the void of space. The distress call had come hours earlier, a signal from a supposed Allied vessel in an unexplored sector near the outer rim. The ship's name wasn't familiar, but the signature's encryption was undeniably human. They had to respond. They always did. "Entering Haricon system in 30 seconds, Lieutenant Broadbent called out from navigation, while adjusting the ship's trajectory with the knowledge born from years of practice. "Haricon," muttered Corporal Zhao, leaning back in his chair at the comm station. "The name alone sounds like a place you don't want to visit." "Dry, rocky, and completely uninhabitable," quipped Dr. Andrea Lin, the ship's medical officer, from her station near the aft. "Sounds like my last camping trip." The bridge erupted in subdued laughter, even Liebert allowing the faintest smile to tug at the corners of his mouth. The Nemea's crew was hardened by countless missions, but humor was their shield against the void. "Focus," Liebert said, his voice calm but firm. The humor subsided instantly. "We have a distress call to answer. I want every system on high alert when we drop out of hyperspace. If this is a trap, I don't intend to walk into it blind." "Aye, sir," came the chorus of responses. Zhao adjusted his headset, while Gunnery Officer Mendoza ran diagnostics on the ship's weapon systems. At the far end of the room, Engineer Clark muttered something under her breath, her eyes locked on the fluctuating reactor output. "Think this one's for real?" Clark called over her shoulder, her tone more curious than skeptical. Liebert turned, giving her a faint smirk. "We don't jump into unknown space for ghost signals, Clark. If it's a prank, someone's getting court-martialed." A ripple of low laughter spread across the bridge, easing some of the tension. It wasn't uncommon for distress signals to be misfires or glitches, but this one felt different. It had come through clean, consistent, too intentional to ignore. "Dropping in 3, 2, 1, Zhao counted down, and the swirling patterns of hyperspace gave way to the vast black void, stars dotting the expanse like shards of broken glass. The planet Haricon loomed ahead, its surface a wasteland of jagged canyons and shifting dust storms. Orbiting the planet was the source of the distress signal, a solitary human ship, its darkened hull pockmarked with scorch marks and debris. "There it is," Broadbent said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Signals coming through strong. That's our ship." Liebert's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer to the viewport. The ship was unmistakably human in design, but its condition was worse than he had expected. "Visual on the distress signal origin," Broadbent confirmed. "It's the TSS Ardent. No visible power signatures except for the beacon. She's dead in the water." "Broadbent, hail them," Liebert ordered. "Let them know we're here." "Yes, sir." And Zhao worked his console, and the bridge fell silent as he initiated the transmission. The faint crackle of static filled the room, stretching on for several long seconds. "No response," Broadbent said, frowning. "Trying another frequency." Liebert exchanged a glance with Mendoza, who was already pulling up tactical overlays of the surrounding area. "Still nothing, Captain," Broadbent continued. "They're broadcasting the distress signal, but there's no response on any channel." "Hold us steady at 2 clicks out," Liebert ordered, his eyes locked on the Ardent. "Comms, open a channel, and keep it clean. I don't want them missing this if they're alive." Zhao nodded, leaning forward as he opened a channel. "TSS Ardent, this is the UES Nemea responding to your distress call. Do you read me?" Static crackled through the speakers, followed by a long silence. Zhao adjusted the frequencies, his brow furrowing. "Nothing, sir," he said, glancing back at Liebert. "Keep trying," Liebert replied, his tone steady. "Scan the ship. I want to know what we're dealing with." The Nemea's sensors swept over the Ardent, and the results began to scroll across the bridge monitors. Zhao shook his head, his brow furrowed. "No life signs, but the interference from the planet's atmosphere is throwing off our readings." "She's a mess," he reported. "Hull integrity at 30%. No active systems. If there's anyone alive on board, they're not answering." "Could be comms damage," Dr. Lin suggested, though her voice carried a note of doubt. Clark snorted softly from her console. Bet they fried half their systems trying to stay alive. Let's not speculate, LeBird said sharply, though his tone lacked malice. Mendoza, weapons status. Online and ready, sir. No signs of hostiles in the area. Mendoza hesitated, then added, but this whole setup feels wrong. Agreed, Liebert muttered, stepping closer to the viewport. Something about the scene gnawed at the edges of his instincts. A derelict vessel this close to Harakon? A system no one had reason to approach? The pieces didn't fit. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, a sensation he had learned to trust over decades of service. The ship was too damaged to be functional, yet its beacon had been activated with military precision. Captain, Broadbent said, his voice strained. The signal just cut out. Liberd's head snapped toward him. What do you mean, cut out? It's gone, sir. No warning, no interference, just gone. Before Liebert could respond, Zhao cursed under his breath. Contact! Multiple signatures, incoming at high velocity. The ship jolted violently, cutting him off. Alarms blared across the Nemia's bridge, and the view screen lit up with incoming contacts. A fleet of Krell ships, their angular insect-like designs glinting menacingly, dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation. They wasted no time, their weapons already charging. Defensive maneuvers! Liebert barked. Raise shields and return fire! The Nemia shuddered as the first volley struck, bright streaks of plasma fire slicing through the void. The Krell assault was overwhelming, a swarm of vessels converging like predators scenting blood. The crew scrambled to respond, their years of training barely keeping up with the chaos unfolding around them. Broadbent, evasive pattern Delta 5, Liebert shouted. Zhao, call for reinforcements. Signals jammed, sir, Zhao replied, his voice tight with frustration. The Nemia's guns roared, sending bursts of retaliatory fire into the Krell ranks, but the enemy's numbers were staggering. One by one, the ship's systems faltered under the relentless assault. Shields at 30%, Mendoza called out. Hull breaches on decks 3 and 4. Dr. Lin braced herself against a console as the ship lurched again. We can't take much more of this. Liebert gritted his teeth, his mind racing through options. They were outmatched and outgunned, and every second brought them closer to destruction. But surrender was not an option. Divert all power to the engines, he commanded. We need to break free. Broadbent worked frantically, sparks raining from the consoles as he rerouted power. The Nemia surged forward, its engines straining under the load. For a fleeting moment, it seemed they might escape the kill zone. Broadbent, send a distress call. Broad spectrum, he commanded. But the comms officer shook his head. Comms are down, sir. Then the Krell unleashed their full arsenal. The Nemia's shields collapsed, and the ship was racked by a cascade of explosions. The hull groaned as the engines faltered, and the lights on the bridge flickered. Liebert was thrown against the railing, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. Around him, the crew fought to stay upright, their faces pale but focused. Sir, Zhao gasped, blood streaking down his temple. We're going down! Liebert forced himself to his feet, gripping the railing for support. Brace for impact, he ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. The Nemia spiraled toward Harakon, fire trailing from its engines. The impact was cataclysmic. The last thing Liebert saw before the ship hit the surface was the Krell fleet hovering above, their victory assured. Metal shrieked as the Nemia tore through the rocky terrain, scattering debris across the barren landscape. When Liebert awoke, he was lying in the dirt, the air heavy with the stench of smoke and burning metal. His body screamed in protest as he tried to move, sharp pain radiating from his ribs. He blinked, his vision clearing to reveal the shattered remains of the Nemia, around him a twisted graveyard of steel and ash. Bodies lay motionless amid the debris, Broadbent, Zhao, Lin, Mendoza, Clark, their faces frozen in expressions of fear and determination. Liebert's heart clenched, but there was no time to grieve. In the distance he saw movement. The Krell had begun to descend, their figures silhouetted against the harsh glare of Harakon's sun. They moved with purpose, scavenging the remains of the Nemia with a cold, robotic manner. Liebert's hand brushed against something solid. He looked down to find a shard of metal, jagged and sharp. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Liburd gritted his teeth, forcing himself to his feet. Blood trickled down the side of his face, but he ignored it. Alone, on a hostile planet, surrounded by enemies, Captain John Liburd did the only thing he could. He prepared to fight. He was alive, and that was their mistake. John Liburd scanned his surroundings, forcing his mind to cut through the fog of pain. And then he noticed the shrapnel embedded in his body, a grim reminder of the violence that had brought him here. He clenched his jaw, biting back a wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm him. His injuries would slow him, but they wouldn't stop him. Not yet. The Krell might have outgunned the Nemia, but they'd made one critical error. They hadn't made sure he was dead. John's breath hitched as movement caught his eye. In the distance, Krell soldiers moved among the ruins focused on the primary wreckage, where the bulk of the ship's systems and supplies were likely concentrated. For now, they hadn't reached this isolated pocket of debris, and Liburd wasn't about to waste the opportunity. He reached for the small first aid kit sewn into his uniform, a compact, standard-issue box designed for emergencies. His fingers fumbled against the latch, the broken arm making even this basic task agonizing. He hissed through gritted teeth as he finally flipped it open, revealing its contents. Grabbing a nano bandage, he braced the kit against his knee. Every movement sent sharp pain radiating from his arm, but the bleeding was the greater threat. He worked with his uninjured hand to press the bandage over the wound. The device activated instantly, sealing the area around the shrapnel and stopping the blood flow. He leaned back briefly, his breath coming in short gasps. The pain was merciless, but extracting the shrapnel could wait. Right now, survival was all that mattered. Tearing a strip of fabric from his torn uniform, he fashioned a makeshift sling for his injured arm. Using his teeth and his uninjured hand, he managed to rip free a piece long enough. Wrapping the cloth over his shoulder and around his torso, he secured it tightly with his free hand. The process was clumsy and torturous, but the sling held. Keeping low to the ground, he began to move, his boots crunching softly against the gritty soil. The jagged rock formations nearby cast shifting shadows, offering brief moments of cover. Every step felt like a gamble, the Krell patrols spreading out in disciplined formations as they scoured the crash site. He needed to stay out of sight, and fast. Ahead, a series of jagged cliffs loomed, their surfaces marked by cracks and crevices that hinted at hidden caverns within. It was his best chance. He shifted his weight onto his good leg and pressed forward, keeping his movements deliberate and controlled. The sound of his own breathing seemed deafening in the eerie quiet of the wasteland. The entrance to the cavern was narrow, barely wide enough for him to squeeze through. The rock scraped against his shoulders as he slid inside, the temperature dropping sharply as the light faded. He allowed himself a brief moment to exhale, his back pressing against the cool stone. Safe, for now. John's hand drifted to his chest pocket, pulling out the small survival kit again. This time he retrieved a mini-torch and a single dose of pain suppressant. The suppressant would dull the pain quickly, but it wouldn't restore his strength, and strength was something he couldn't afford to lose. Not now. The torch's faint beam illuminated jagged mineral deposits, their edges glinting in the darkness. The damp air carried the soft sound of trickling water, but this was no time to explore. Staying ahead of the Krell was all that mattered. Forcing himself to his feet, he turned his attention back to the wreckage. From his vantage point at the cavern's entrance, he could see the Krell patrols growing more aggressive, their movements punctuated by bursts of alien chatter. They were closing in. If he was going to turn the tide, he needed resources, and there was only one place to find them. Using the terrain to his advantage, John slipped from the cavern under the cover of dusk. The light softened as Harakon's sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the debris field. The Krell weren't near his immediate position, but their patrols circled the wider crash site with disciplined efficiency. Though advanced, their technology seemed hampered by Harakon's atmosphere, forcing them to rely on visual sweeps instead of heat scanners. Their faintly glowing armor, bioluminescent in the dim light, gave away their movements, making them easier to track. For now, the patrols remained at a distance, but John knew even a small misstep could draw them closer. He moved with painstaking care, his footsteps muffled by the soft soil. The remains of the Nemea loomed ahead, its once proud form now a shattered husk. He approached what had once been the ship's engineering bay, his eyes scanning for anything salvageable. The Krell had clearly been through here, but they'd underestimated the value of what they left behind. A faint glow caught his attention. A terminal, barely functional, its screen flickering like a dying ember. John crouched beside it, his fingers brushing over the cracked surface. He worked quickly, bypassing damaged systems and redirecting power from an auxiliary battery he'd scavenged earlier. The screen stabilized, and lines of code scrolled across it. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, while working the commands. The Krell had corrupted parts of the system, but the core remained intact. He navigated to the comms array, his training kicking in as he encrypted a distress signal. The codes he used were old, outdated, but they carried a signature the fleet would recognize. The signal pulsed once, then again, its faint transmission cutting through the void. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He leaned back, exhaling slowly as the weight of the moment settled over him. Help might be days or weeks away, but at least he'd made his voice heard. A sharp sound snapped him out of his thoughts. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate. The Krell were closer than he'd realized. He killed the terminal's power and slid back into the shadows, his heart pounding in his ears. He retreated to a nearby outcropping, scanning the terrain for something, anything that could give him an edge. His eyes landed on a piece of the Nemea's hull, warped but intact. Dragging it toward him, he worked quickly, his mind racing. If he could control the Krell's approach, he could turn the fragment into a weapon. Using exposed wiring and a damaged capacitor, he rigged the hull into a crude, unstable trap. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He positioned it at the entrance of a narrow pass, carefully aligning it to funnel the Krell toward the device. All he needed now was bait. John angled the light from his torch with a shard of reflective glass, creating a faint glimmer near the trap. It was a risk, but one he had to take. Then, gripping his improvised blade tightly, he retreated to a higher vantage point to wait. Minutes dragged like hours as the Krell approached, their alien voices murmuring in low, guttural tones he couldn't understand. Their bioluminescent armor flickered faintly as they advanced, weapons raised. The first stepped into the pass, followed by another, then a third. He waited until they were all within range. The trap detonated with a deafening roar. The capacitor overloaded, releasing a violent burst of energy that hurled the Krell against the rocks like broken marionettes. Their cries were silenced instantly. John didn't hesitate. He descended into the chaos like a predator, his blade slicing through the survivors before they could recover. Each movement was calculated, brutal, and final. When the dust settled, he stood amid the carnage, his chest heaving with exertion. Krell bodies lay scattered around him, their glowing armor dimming as life ebbed away. He stared at them for a moment, his expression grim. This was only the beginning. He turned toward the wreckage, the faint light of the terminal still visible in the distance. The Krell weren't done searching, and neither was he. The air hung heavy with the acrid scent of burning circuitry and scorched flesh. John knelt beside one of the fallen Krell, his hands moving quickly as he stripped its body of anything useful. Their weapons were sleek and alien, their grips awkward in his human hands, but they were far more advanced than his crude blade. He examined the rifle-like device, testing its weight before slinging it over his shoulder. A belt of strange, cylindrical charges, likely grenades, was secured around his waist. "That's better," he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse from the smoke and exhaustion. The Krell's armor still pulsed faintly, casting an eerie glow on their lifeless forms. John's stomach turned, but he forced himself to focus. He couldn't afford hesitation, not here, not now. He moved methodically, gathering supplies and committing the terrain to memory. The pass where he'd set the trap was narrow, flanked by jagged rocks that created natural choke points. As the night deepened, John retreated to higher ground, a cluster of rocky outcroppings that offered a panoramic view of the wreckage below. He crouched low, his silhouette blending into the uneven terrain. The Krell patrols were more active now, their movements sharper, more urgent. They'd found the aftermath of his ambush. Through the scope of a scavenged Krell weapon, he watched them work. Their search patterns were disciplined, but their body language betrayed unease. They moved in tighter formations, their weapons sweeping in synchronized arcs. Occasionally, one would glance over its shoulder, as though expecting to find the predator lurking in the shadows. John allowed himself a faint, grim smile. They were beginning to feel it, the subtle shift from hunter to hunted. He spent hours observing, tracking their routes and identifying weak points. They returned to the same locations with predictable regularity: the main wreckage of the Nemia, a cluster of supply caches they'd established, and a central point where a larger group gathered around what appeared to be a command node. Their movements followed a rhythm, one he could exploit. At dawn, John descended from his vantage point, his path taking him back through the debris field. He moved cautiously, his senses heightened. The Krell's presence was thicker here, their guttural voices audible over the distant hum of scavenged equipment. He kept to the shadows, his body pressed low against the jagged rocks. Near the ruins of the Nemia's engineering section, he found what he was looking for: the remainders of the ship's auxiliary power systems. The Krell had stripped most of it, but they'd overlooked a cluster of unstable reactor cores partially buried beneath a collapsed bulkhead. John's lips pressed into a thin line. This would do. With trembling hands, he wedged a shard of metal into the reactor's casing, the faint glow of its core spilling out like liquid fire. It was depleted, unstable, but unstable was exactly what he needed. John scavenged wires, capacitors, and a handful of shattered fuel cells, his mind piecing together the components of a crude explosive. The process was grueling. His hands trembled from exhaustion. The nano-bandage on his side, once tightly sealed, was now loosening under the strain. Blood seeped through, a stark reminder that his efforts were pushing his body beyond its limits. Sweat dripped into his eyes, stinging, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. By the time he finished, the device was primitive but functional. A single trigger mechanism, rigged to detonate on impact, was housed within a fragment of the ship's hull. He hefted it carefully, testing its weight. It wasn't elegant, but it would be enough to disrupt the Krell's operations. He secured the explosive to his pack and moved on. The first explosion tore through the Krell supply cache with a concussive force that rippled across the arid landscape of Harakon. John watched from a ridge, his body pressed low against the jagged rocks. Flames licked the edges of the wreckage, sending plumes of acrid smoke spiraling into the dusty sky. The Krell scrambled in disarray, their guttural voices sharp with confusion as they rushed to assess the damage. They hadn't seen him. Not yet. He adjusted his position, cradling the energy rifle he'd scavenged from his earlier ambush. The weapon felt foreign in his hands, its weight unbalanced, but it had become an extension of him now. He shifted his gaze to the Krell as they regrouped near the remnants of their destroyed cache. They were agitated, their movements sharp and erratic. John couldn't understand their language, but he didn't need to. Their body language told him everything. His breath was slow and controlled as he settled the rifle's scope over a cluster of Krell inspecting the wreckage. One moved to the center, gesturing sharply to the others. A leader, perhaps. John's finger tightened on the trigger. The shot was precise, the energy bolt slicing through the leader's chest in a burst of light. The creature crumpled, and chaos erupted. The remaining Krell scattered, their formations collapsing as they sought cover from an enemy they couldn't see. John didn't linger. He slid back down the ridge, using the natural terrain to mask his retreat. Every movement calculated. He had no intention of being caught. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, John had launched 3 more strikes. Each one targeted a critical resource: a power relay, a secondary supply cache, and an equipment station where the Krell had begun assembling makeshift defenses. The Krell were responding, but they were too slow to stop him. As he moved through the shadows, John's mind raced. He'd been studying their movements for 2 days, watching how they communicated, how they reacted. Their rigid, hierarchical structure made them predictable, and predictability was a weakness he could exploit. He used the signals from the Nemia's terminal to feed them false leads, luring patrols into dead ends or exposing them to ambushes. Each time they followed his bait, they paid the price. The Krell were beginning to fracture. John could see it in the way they moved, their formations growing tighter, their gestures more frantic. They no longer trusted their patrol routes. doubling back to check areas they'd already searched. Occasionally, one would break formation entirely, darting into the shadows as if fleeing an unseen predator. John capitalized on every mistake. He struck at night, using the cover of Harakon's relentless dust storms to obscure his movements. His attacks were swift and brutal. A volley of rifle fire, a grenade hurled into a cluster of soldiers, a tripwire rigged to a salvaged capacitor. Each encounter left the Krell more disoriented, more paranoid. The toll on John's body was mounting. His injuries were a constant reminder of how close he was to the edge. His hands trembled as he reloaded his rifle, his muscles screaming in protest with every movement. The isolation was worse than the pain. Harakon was silent, save for the howling winds that swept through its canyons. John caught himself speaking aloud, his voice hoarse and broken as he cursed the Krell under his breath. Occasionally, he heard the voices of his crew, not real, of course, but memories surfacing unbidden. "You always overthink these things," Mendoza's voice echoed in his mind, accompanied by the faint image of the gunnery officer's easy grin. John exhaled sharply, his jaw clenched. Mendoza was gone, just like the rest of them. He couldn't let himself dwell on it. "Focus," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Stay sharp." As the days stretched on, the Krell's paranoia reached a breaking point. John observed from a distance as a patrol stumbled upon one of his traps, a simple tripwire connected to a rigged explosive. The blast was devastating, scattering debris and alien limbs across the terrain. The survivors didn't regroup. Instead, they turned on each other, their weapons raised as they barked accusations in their guttural tongue. John watched, his chest heaving as he tried to suppress a grim satisfaction. They were tearing themselves apart, but the satisfaction was fleeting. As he crouched behind the rocks, his vision swam, and a wave of dizziness nearly toppled him. He pressed a hand to his side, feeling the warmth of fresh blood seeping through his bandage. His strength was waning, and he knew it. The night after his most intense ambush yet, John found refuge in a narrow cave tucked into the cliffs. He stumbled inside, his legs barely supporting him as he collapsed against the cold stone. The rifle slipped from his grasp, clattering to the ground. His breathing was ragged, each inhale a struggle. The cave was dark, the air damp and heavy. He felt the weight of his exhaustion pressing down on him, the adrenaline that had fueled him finally giving way to the reality of his injuries. He leaned back, his head resting against the rock. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to stop. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint trickle of water somewhere deeper in the cave. "I can't keep this up," he muttered, his voice barely audible. His hand drifted to the dog tags around his neck, his fingers brushing over the cold metal. "You hear that, Mendoza? Clark? I can't keep this up." He closed his eyes, the faces of his crew flashing through his mind. Their laughter, their voices, their determination, they were all gone, but they were with him still. They had to be. "Just a little longer," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to them or to himself. As exhaustion claimed him, John's grip tightened around the rifle at his side. The Krell might have had the numbers, the technology, the resources, but they didn't have what he had. They didn't have the ghosts. The cave was suffocatingly quiet, but John Liebert's mind was anything but. He had barely succumbed to exhaustion when a voice jolted him awake, a familiar one. "John," Clark's voice called softly, distant yet clear, tugging him back to consciousness. His eyes snapped open, his back still pressed against the cold stone. The rifle remained on his lap, his grip loose but instinctively ready, his fingers brushing the trigger. He shifted closer to the entrance, his gaze locking onto the jagged expanse of Harakon's desolate terrain. The Krell had changed their behavior. He'd seen it in their patrols, tighter formations, more coordinated movements. They were no longer simply reacting to his attacks. They were hunting him. The shift wasn't subtle, and it wasn't random. They knew what he was, and they were adapting. John thumbed the small device clipped to his wrist, a scavenged Krell communicator that hummed faintly with intercepted signals. Their language was incomprehensible, a mess of guttural clicks and hisses, but the patterns told him enough. They were triangulating his position, setting up a perimeter to funnel him into their trap. He flexed his fingers against the cold metal of the rifle. If the Krell thought they could box him in, they hadn't learned enough yet. The first step was understanding the trap. John spent hours moving through the shadows, tracking the Krell as they established their positions. He crept along the ridges and outcroppings, his movements silent like a shadow. The terrain was his ally here. Jagged cliffs and narrow passes offered natural concealment, while the frequent dust storms masked his presence. From his vantage points, he pieced together their plan. The Krell were herding him toward the central wreckage of the Nemea. They'd deployed patrols along the surrounding ridges, their bioluminescent markings faint but visible in the distance. A larger force was massing near the ship's remains, where they were preparing for a confrontation. John crouched low behind a cluster of boulders, his mind racing as he studied their positions. The wreckage was both an opportunity and a risk. It was where the Krell expected him to go, but it was also where the resources he needed were buried. He had no choice but to take the gamble. The faint glow of the Nemea's ruined hull came into view as John crept closer, his body low to the ground. He could see the Krell now, their figures silhouetted against the flickering fires that still smoldered in parts of the wreckage. They were methodical, scanning every corner of the debris field, their weapons ready. John kept his movements cautious, slipping between shadows as he approached the engineering section. He needed access to the reactor cores. Their instability could be turned into a weapon powerful enough to level the Krell's staging area. The ground beneath his feet shifted, and a rock tumbled noisily down the slope. John froze, his breath caught in his throat. One of the Krell turned sharply, its glowing eyes scanning the ridge. The moment stretched into eternity as John pressed himself against the cold rock, his heart hammering in his chest. The alien's gaze lingered, its weapon raised, but it didn't advance. After a tense moment, it turned back to the others, barking a series of sharp clicks. John exhaled silently, his grip on the rifle tightening. He couldn't afford another mistake. The reactor cores were just as he expected, partially buried beneath a collapsed bulkhead, their damaged casings glowing faintly. John worked quickly, his hands steady, despite the tremors of exhaustion that threatened to betray him. He scavenged wires, capacitors, and shards of metal from the surrounding wreckage, piecing together the components of a crude but devastating explosive. As he worked, his mind drifted to another mission, years ago. A jungle planet, thick with humidity and hostile fauna. His unit had been surrounded, pinned down by enemy forces with no clear path to safety. It had been John who'd devised the plan, using the environment to set traps and draw the enemy into ambushes. They'd called him reckless then, but it had worked. They'd survived. Most of them. "You can do this," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. "You've done it before." The explosive device was nearly complete, a cluster of reactor cores rigged to detonate on a remote trigger. It wasn't sophisticated, but it didn't need to be. It just needed to work. The Krell's movements grew more focused as the night deepened. John could see them regrouping near the central wreckage, their patrols converging into a single force. They were closing the net, confident their trap was ready. But they hadn't accounted for his trap. John positioned the explosive at the heart of the wreckage, concealing it beneath a pile of debris. He rigged the trigger to a scavenged comm relay, its signal programmed to detonate the device on his command. The blast radius would be devastating, enough to cripple the Krell's central force and throw their operation into chaos. He retreated to a ridge overlooking the wreckage, his body low to the ground as he observed the Krell. They were gathering now, their leaders barking commands as the soldiers fanned out across the debris field. John's fingers hovered over the relay, his pulse steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. From his vantage point, John watched as the Krell moved into position, their figures clustering near the explosive's concealed location. He could see the faint, bioluminescent streaks of their armor, the steady rhythm of their movements. They were confident. They believed they were in control. John's lips pressed into a thin line. They were wrong. The dim light of Harakon's twin moons illuminated the armors of the Krell clustered around the wreckage of the Nemea. John's fingers hovered over the comm relay. The faint hum of its signal felt almost alive against his fingertips. His pulse slowed, his breath steadying as he centered himself. His eyes locked on the center of the gathering, where the Krell leaders had unknowingly positioned themselves directly over his concealed explosive. He pressed the trigger. The explosion ripped through the night like a primal scream, the earth convulsing under the sheer force of the blast. A brilliant flash of light glowed on the battlefield, casting jagged shadows across the rocky terrain. The reactor cores detonated in a chain reaction, their unstable energy ripping through the Krell ranks in a wave of fire and shrapnel. Bodies were hurled through the air like broken puppets, their armor splintering under the sheer force. From his vantage point, John watched the carnage unfold. The organized lines of the Krell dissolved instantly, replaced by chaos. Their guttural cries echoed across the wasteland as survivors scrambled for cover, their formations collapsing under the weight of confusion and fear. John acted fast. He descended from the ridge, moving like a ghost through the dust and smoke. His rifle was already in his hands, its stolen battery pack humming faintly as he leveled it at the first group of Krell. The shot was clean, and the soldier dropped before it could react. The first skirmish was over in seconds. 3 Krell lay dead. John scavenged quickly, his hands moving fast and confident as he stripped them of weapons and ammunition. His mind was a blur of calculations, where the next group would be, how much ammunition he had left, how long he could keep this pace before his body gave out. The Krell were faltering. John could see it in their movements, their hesitations. Small groups wandered aimlessly through the debris field, their weapons raised but their focus fractured. They no longer moved with the confidence of a superior force. Instead, they seemed haunted. John struck without mercy. A group of 4 Krell soldiers patrolling the western edge of the wreckage fell victim to one of his traps. A stolen explosive that left their bodies hurled against the rocks in a twisted tangle of limbs and shattered armor. Another group near the collapsed engineering bay fared no better. John used the terrain to his advantage, circling around them and picking them off one by one. His rifle spat bursts of energy, each shot finding its mark before the Krell could react. By the time they realized what was happening, half their number lay dead. But John's body was beginning to betray him. His injuries, ignored for too long, were catching up. Every movement sent a lance of pain through his side, the hastily applied bandage soaked through with blood. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, and his vision blurred at the edges. He stumbled as he moved between positions, his balance faltering on the uneven terrain. He pressed on. The Krell were collapsing. Their patrols no longer coordinated, their attempts to regroup undermined by paranoia and exhaustion. John could hear their frantic chatter through the communicator strapped to his wrist, the patterns disjointed and chaotic. They seemed to spoke of a ghost, or something like that, among the wreckage. The word repeated in their guttural tones, their fear visible even through the alien dialect. John smiled grimly. Let them think he was a ghost. The final confrontation came near the central wreckage. A cluster of Krell, perhaps the last cohesive unit, had barricaded themselves near what remained of their command node. John watched from the shadows, his breathing labored as he assessed the situation. There were too many for a direct attack. He reached into his pack, pulling out one of the last grenades he'd collected from his attacks. The device felt heavy in his hands, its alien design unfamiliar, but intuitive enough. He armed it with a flick of his thumb, the faint hum of its charge vibrating through his fingertips. With a deep breath, he hurled the grenade toward the barricade. The explosion was instantaneous, the shockwave tearing through the Krell's defenses and scattering their ranks. John moved in the chaos, his rifle snapping to his shoulder as he picked off the survivors. His movements were slower now, less precise, but every shot counted. A Krell soldier lunged at him from the smoke, its blade flashing in the dim light. John twisted to avoid the strike, but the movement was sluggish, and the blade caught his arm, slicing through fabric and skin. He cried out, the pain searing, but he drove his own blade into the creature's chest, his strength fueled by sheer determination. Broadbent, Zhao, Lin, Mendoza, Clark. Their names echoed in his mind like a mantra, tethering him to the moment, driving him forward. When the dust finally settled, silence blanketed the battlefield. John stood alone in the wreckage, his breaths ragged, his frame trembling under the weight of exhaustion and victory. Blood dripped from the wound on his arm, pooling at his feet. He swayed, his vision narrowing as the edges of the world blurred. As he stumbled toward the nearest console, his steps faltered. For a moment, he could see them, his crew. Broadbent leaning against a console with a wry grin, Mendoza tightening a strap on her gear, Zhao and Lin whispering about some joke he'd never understand, and Clark furrowing her brow, always ready for the next problem to solve. They weren't real. He knew that. But in the haze of pain and exhaustion, their presence steadied him. His hands shook as he accessed the comms array, his fingers fumbling over the keys. The encrypted signal pulsed weakly, the last fragment of the Nemia's strength carrying his message into the void. "This is Captain John Liberd," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "Haracon. Coordinates. Enemy. Send help." His vision swam, the edges of the console fading into darkness. He collapsed to the ground, the cold metal of the deck pressing against his cheek. His breathing slowed. The faint hum of the comms array and the imagined murmur of his crew the last sounds he heard before the darkness claimed him. Unbeknownst to John, the initial distress beacon he'd managed to send days earlier had reached the fleet. Though faint and fragmented, its encryption conveyed enough urgency that Command mobilized a reconnaissance team. They had been closing in on Haracon for the last 24 hours, triangulating the signal, their arrival delayed by the need to evade Krell patrols scattered along the outer rim. The air above Haracon trembled as the first human vessels broke through the planet's atmosphere. Their sleek hulls glinted in the light of the twin moons, a sharp contrast to the jagged desolation below. Engines roared, cutting through the choking silence that had engulfed the wreckage of the Nemia. The lead ship, its markings unmistakable as a UES-class destroyer, descended like a steel predator, bristling with weaponry. On the ground, the remaining Krell froze. The alien soldiers, already battered and disorganized from John's relentless assault, turned their bioluminescent heads skyward. Their guttural chatter rose in pitch, frantic and sharp. The organized retreat they had been attempting to orchestrate dissolved in an instant as the reality of their situation became clear. Reinforcements had arrived, but not theirs. John Liberd lay motionless in the ruins of the Nemia, his body barely visible beneath a tangle of debris and ash. The faint hum of the comms array still pulsed beside him, a flickering beacon in the chaos. The first explosion jolted him awake. The sound was deafening, a thunderous roar that shook the ground beneath him. Through the haze of pain, John registered the distant, unmistakable crack of human railguns. A second explosion followed, then a third, each one closer than the last. He blinked, his vision swimming as shadows moved across the smoke-filled sky. He wasn't sure if he was dreaming until the distinct, clipped cadence of a human voice crackled through his communicator. "This is Admiral Kinnear of the UES Gaia to all ground units. Target Krell positions and engage on sight. No quarter." Relief washed over John like a tide. They'd heard him. They'd come. The Krell's retreat turned into a rout as the first wave of human dropships touched down. Soldiers in dark, angular armor poured from the ships, their movements precise and unrelenting. Plasma bursts from Krell rifles lit up the battlefield, but the humans returned fire with a ferocity the aliens couldn't match. High-energy railgun rounds tore through Krell formations, scattering bodies and shrapnel in their wake. Overhead, fighter craft screamed through the skies, strafing Krell positions with pinpoint accuracy. The ground shook as heavy ordnance rained down, tearing apart the barricades the aliens had so hastily constructed. The Krell's bioluminescent markings, once a sign of their strength, now flickered erratically as panic spread through their ranks. From the cockpit of her dropship, Lieutenant Commander Maria Ray surveyed the battlefield. Her sharp green eyes narrowed as she studied the tactical display, the Krell positions blinking red against the map's glowing grid. She keyed her comms, her voice calm but firm. "Bravo, team. Secure the central wreckage. Alpha, push forward and clear the ridge. No stragglers." Near the central wreckage, the Krell's desperation reached its peak. Their soldiers broke formation, abandoning equipment and weapons as they fled toward the surrounding cliffs. Those who remained tried to hold their ground, their guttural cries defiant as they fired blindly into the dust-choked air. It wasn't enough. A hail of human fire cut through their ranks, the soldiers of the UES Gaia moving with ruthless precision. One by one, the Krell fell, their superior numbers rendered meaningless by the sheer ferocity of the human assault. "They're breaking," called a voice through the comms. "We've got them pinned." "Finish it," Ray ordered. Her ship hovered above the battlefield, its thrusters kicking up clouds of dust as it descended. "Secure the area and locate Captain Liebert." John's world was a blur of sound and shadow. He barely registered the approaching footsteps, the muffled shouts that pierced the haze. A hand gripped his shoulder, firm but careful, and he felt himself being lifted. Voices swirled around him, fragments of conversation he couldn't quite piece together. "Found him!" someone shouted. "He's alive, but barely." "Get a medic over here now!" John's head tilted weakly, his vision fading in and out as he caught fragments of movement. Soldiers in dark visors, the fires of battle still dancing in their reflections, every motion executed with efficiency. He felt a needle prick his arm, a rush of cold spreading through his veins as his breathing steadied. "Hang in there, Captain," said a voice close to his ear. It was calm, authoritative, a medic, judging by the tone. "You're safe now. Broadbent, Zhao, Lin, Mendoza, Clark, safe." The word lingered in John's mind, a fragile concept he hadn't allowed himself to entertain until now. The Krell was shattered. The few survivors scrambled toward the cliffs, abandoning weapons and hope alike, their retreat echoing with guttural cries of panic. Human forces pursued them briefly before pulling back, their focus shifting to securing the battlefield. The wreckage of the Nemea was now under human control, its jagged silhouette standing as a testament to the cost of survival. The battlefield was eerily quiet now, save for the hum of engines and the muffled footsteps of soldiers moving through the wreckage. What was left of their forces, scattered bodies, shattered equipment, and broken morale, was a stark testament to their defeat. Human soldiers moved methodically, securing the field. Groups of engineers worked to dismantle Krell equipment and recover whatever could be salvaged from the ruins of the Nemea. Others escorted the surviving Krell prisoners toward the massive UES Gaia, their weapons ready but lowered. The captured aliens moved sluggishly, their glowing armor dim, their heads bowed in defeat. Amidst the controlled chaos, a team of medics crouched over John Liebert, working quickly to keep him alive. His breathing was shallow, his face pale and his pulse weak, but he was hanging in there. One of the medics, a young man with a grim expression, adjusted an IV while speaking to his colleague. "Vitals are weak, but stable. We need to get him to the med bay on the GEA before his blood pressure crashes." "Clear a path," the other medic barked, waving at nearby soldiers to give them space. Together, they lifted John onto a stretcher, careful not to jar the deep wounds that crisscrossed his torso and arms. John's eyelids fluttered, and he stirred slightly, his lips moving in a faint murmur. The medic closest to him leaned in, her brow furrowing. "Captain Liebert, can you hear me? You're safe now. Just hold on." John's eyes opened, barely, his vision swimming. His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Don't forget the Krell." The medic gave him a tight smile. "Don't worry, Captain. We've got it under control." The procession to the GEA was steady and methodical. Human soldiers marched in formation, flanking the line of Krell prisoners. Medics carried John on a stretcher toward the waiting dropship that would ferry him to the medical frigate. The tension of battle had dissipated, replaced by the disciplined rhythm of a victorious army securing its hold. As they neared the dropship's ramp, one of the Krell at the front of the prisoner line stopped abruptly. Guards barked orders, shoving the alien forward, but it hesitated, turning its elongated head toward John. Its multifaceted eyes glinted faintly in the dim light, and its mandibles twitched as it spoke in a low, guttural tone. The medic beside John activated the Krell translator. The alien's clicks and hisses transformed into human words. "You were alone," the Krell said, its tone thick with disbelief. "One human did all this." John's heavy-lidded eyes opened slightly. His voice was hoarse but steady as he met the alien's gaze. "We're humans," he said. "Broadbent, Zhao, Lin, Mendoza, Clark. We never give up, and we never forget." The Krell tilted its head, mandibles twitching as if it was weighing his words. But the guards didn't give it time to linger. A sharp command sent the alien forward, and the moment passed. John was carried into the dropship as the ramp sealed shut behind them. The engines roared, lifting the craft off the planet. Through a small viewport, he caught a glimpse of Harakon, fading beneath a haze of smoke and ash, the jagged wreckage of the Nemea, barely visible amid the desolation. By the time the dropship docked with the Gaia, the flagship was already in orbit, its position commanding a view of the scarred planet below. John was rushed into the medical bay, where the sterile, controlled environment contrasted starkly with the chaos he'd endured. Medics worked quickly, tending to his wounds and stabilizing his vitals. Hours passed. The fleet regrouped, their sleek vessels aligning into formation, their movements precise as they prepared to jump to FTL. From his cot, propped against the wall of the medical bay, John could see Harakon through the viewport, a desolate orb marked by craters and fire. The faint glow of explosions flickered across its surface, the final remnants of the Krell's defeat. John's gaze lingered on the scene, his expression unreadable. His body ached, his mind clouded with exhaustion, but a faint sense of closure settled in his chest. The Gaia's engines flared, and the fleet surged forward, leaving Harakon behind. John closed his eyes, letting the quiet hum of the ship carry him into a deep, dreamless sleep. Hey there again. I'm glad you've come so far. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to hit the like button and the subscribe button. This is really important to the channel. Really important. And I have one more thing for you. I've chosen another video for you to watch. Just click the card here, or here if you want the whole playlist. See you there.